early 2010s, a series of uprisings against unpopular authoritarian governments spread across the Middle East, a wave of action that became known as the Arab Spring. Tunisia was where it started, a man setting himself on fire in protest against the nation's brazenly corrupt government and all that he had suffered under that government. And the spreading of this final gesture on social media, which was burgeoning at the time, amplified by the still relatively newfound availability and popularity of smartphones, the mobile internet, and the common capacity to share images and videos of things as they happen to folks around the world via social media, led to a bunch of protests and riots and uprisings in Jordan, Egypt, Yemen, and Algeria initially, before then spreading to other mostly Arab-majority, mostly authoritarian-led nations. The impact of this cascade of unrest on this region was immediately felt. Within just 2 years, by early 2012, those ruling Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen had been toppled. There were attempts to topple the Bahraini and Syrian governments, and there were massive protests in Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, Oman, Algeria, and Sudan, and relatively minor protests which were still meaningful because of the potential punishments for folks who rocked the boat in these countries. Smaller protests erupted in Djibouti, Western Sahara, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, and Mauritania. Several rulers and their ruling parties committed to stepping down soon or to not run for re-election. Some of them actually stuck with that commitment, though others rode out this period of tumult and then quietly backtracked. Some nations saw long-lasting periods of unrest following this eruption. Jordan had trouble keeping a government in office for years, for instance, while Yemen overthrew its government in 2012 and 2015, and that spun out into a civil war between the official government and the Iran-backed Houthis, which continues today, gumming up the Red Sea and significantly disrupting global shipping as a consequence. What I'd like to talk about today, though, is another seriously disruptive sequence of events that have shaped the region, and a lot of things globally as well, since the first sparks of what became the Arab Spring, namely the Syrian civil war, and some movement we have seen in this conflict over the past week that could result in a dramatically new state of affairs across the region. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. In 1963, inspired by their brethren's successful coup in nearby Iraq, the military wing of the Arab Nationalist Ba'ath Party of Syria launched a coup against the country's post-colonial democratic government, installing in its stead a totalitarian party-run government. One of the leaders of this coup, Hafez al-Assad, became the country's president in 1971, which basically meant he was the all-powerful leader of a military dictatorship, and he used those powers to even further consolidate his influence over the mechanisms of state, which meant he also had the ability to name his own successor. He initially planned to install his brother as leader when he stepped down or died, but that brother attempted to overthrow him when he was ill in 1983 and 1984. So when he got better, he exiled said brother and chose his eldest son, Bashar al-Assad, instead. Bashar died in a car accident in 1994, though, so Hafez was left with his third choice, Bashar al-Assad, which was not a popular choice, in part because it was considered not ideal for him to choose a family member in the first place, rather than someone else from the leading party, but also because Bashar had no political experience at the time, so this was straight-up nepotism. The only reason he was selected was that he was family. In mid-2000, Hafez died, and Bashar stepped into the role of president. The next few years were tumultuous for the new leader, who faced heightened calls for more transparency in the government and a return to democracy, or some form of it at least, in Syria. This, added to Bashar's lack of influence with his fellow party members, led to a wave of retirements and purgings amongst the government and the military. Those veteran politicians and generals replaced by loyalists with less experience and credibility. He He then made a series of economic decisions that were really good for the Assad family and their allies, but really bad for pretty much everyone else in the country, which made him and his government even less popular with much of the Syrian population, even amongst those who formerly supported his ascension and his ambitions. All of this pushback from the people nudged Bashar al-Assad into implementing an increasingly stern police state, which pitted various ethnic and religious groups against each other in order to keep them from unifying against him and the government, and which used terror and repression to slap down or kill anyone who stood up to the abuse. When the Arab Spring, which I mentioned in the intro, rippled across the Arab world beginning in 2011, protesters in Syria were treated horribly by the Assad government. The crackdown incredibly violent and punitive, even compared to that of other repressive, totalitarian governments in the region. This led to more pushback from Syrian citizens who began to demand with increasing intensity that the Assad-run government step down, and that the Baathists running the dictatorship be replaced by democratically elected officials. This did not go over well with Assad, who launched a campaign of even more brutal, even more violent crackdowns and mass arrests, and the torture and execution of the people who spoke out on this subject, leading to thousands of confirmed deaths and tens of thousands of people wounded by government forces. This response did not go over super well with the people, and these protests and the pushback against them spiraled into a full-on civil uprising later in 2011. A bunch of people leaving the Syrian military to join the rebels, and the country breaking up into pieces, each chunk of land controlled by a different militia, some of these militias working well together, unifying against the government in some cases, while others also fought other militias, a remnant of the military government's efforts to keep their potential opposition fighting each other rather than them. This conflict was officially declared a civil war by the United Nations in mid-2012, and the UN and other such organizations have been fretting and speaking out about the human rights violations and other atrocities committed during this conflict ever since, though little has been done by external forces practically to end it. Instead, it's become one of many proxy conflicts, various sides supported, mostly with weapons and other resources, though sometimes with training, and in some rare instances with actual soldiers on the ground, by the US, Turkey, Russia, Iran, the Iran-backed group Hezbollah, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Britain, France, Israel, and the Netherlands. A lot of hands involved in this conflict, and that benefit in various ways from keeping it going. This conflict has demanded the country's full attention for more than a decade then, and it's had influence even beyond Syria's borders, as groups like the Islamic State, or IS, or ISIS, has been able to grow and flourish within Syria due to all the chaos and the lack of stability. Refugees from Syria have flooded across borders, fleeing the violence and causing all sorts of unintended disruptions in neighboring and even some further afield countries, where in some cases, millions of these refugees have had to be taken care of, which in turn has influenced immigration-related politics even as far away as the European Union. Also, due to that lack of internal control, crime has flourished in Syria, including drug-related crime. And that's led to a huge production and distribution network for an illegal, almost everywhere, amphetamine called Captagon, which is addictive, and the pills often contain dangerous filler chemicals that are cheaper to produce. This has increased drug crime throughout the region, and the Syrian government itself derives a substantial amount of revenue from these illicit activities. It's responsible for about 80% of global Captagon production as of early 2024, all of which brings us to late 2024. By this point, Syria had been broken up into about 7 or 8 pieces, each controlled by some militia group or government, while other portions, which make up a substantial volume of the country's total landmass, are considered to be up in the air, no dominant factions able to claim them. Al-Assad's government has received a fair bit of support, both in terms of resources and in terms of boots on the ground, from Iran and Russia over the years, especially in the mid-2010s. And due in large part to that assistance, his forces were able to retake most of the opposition's strongholds by late 2018. There was a significant ceasefire at the tail end of 2019, which lasted until March of 2020. This ceasefire stemmed from a successful operation launched by the Syrian government and its allies, especially Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, against the main opposition and some of their allies. Basically, a group of different rebel factions that were working together against Assad, and this included groups backed by the Turkish government. On March 5, 2020, Turkish President Erdogan and Russian President Putin, which were backing opposite sides of this portion of the Syrian civil war, agreed on a ceasefire that began the following day, which among other things included a safety corridor along a major highway, separating the groups from each other, that corridor patrolled by soldiers from Turkey and Russia. This served to end most frontline fighting in the Syrian civil war, as these groups did not want to start fighting these much larger, more powerful nations, Russia and Turkey, while trying to strike their enemies, though there were still smaller scuffles and attacks when either side realized they could hurt their opponent without being caught. In November of 2024, though, a coalition of anti-Assad militias launched a new offensive against the Syrian government's forces, which was ostensibly sparked by heavy shelling by those forces against civilians in rural areas outside Aleppo, the country's second largest city. On the 29th of November, those forces captured most of Aleppo and then plowed their way through previously government-held towns and cities at a pretty rapid clip, capturing another regional capital, Hama, on December 5th and securing Damascus, the capital of the country, on December 8th. This ended the 13-year civil war that has plagued Syria since all the way back in 2011. Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia, according to Russian and Iranian officials, and he resigned before he hopped on that flight. Russian state media is saying that Assad and his family have been granted asylum by the Russian government. This is a rapidly developing story, and we will know more over the next few weeks as the dust settles, but right now, it looks like the Syrian government has been toppled by rebel forces led by a man named Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, a 42-year-old child of Syrian exiles who was born in Saudi Arabia and who spent the early 2000s fighting against U.S. occupation forces in Iraq as part of al-Qaeda. He apparently spent a few years in an Iraqi prison, then led an al-Qaeda affiliate group, which evolved into its own separate thing when he broke ties with al-Qaeda's leadership. This new group that he formed, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, tried to differentiate itself from groups like al-Qaeda by saying they did not want to play a role in the ostensible global jihad. They just wanted to reform the government in Syria. As part of that pivot, they started governing and building infrastructure across the chunk of Syria that they claimed, even to the point of collecting taxes and providing civilians with identity cards. Though throughout this period they were also known for ruling with an iron fist and for being hardcore authoritarians, dedicated to implementing a hardline version of Islamist ideological law. In the midst of their blitz-like capture of Syria, though, representatives from this group have said that they will implement a religiously tolerant representative government, and they will not tell women in the country how to dress. Which may be true, it may be just a brand that they're trying to build. There's no way to know right now, but that is the story that they are telling at the moment. Following the capture of Damascus, Syria's prime minister said that he would remain in the country and that he was ready to work with whomever takes the reins as things settle down, happy to make the transition a smooth and peaceful one, essentially, whatever that might mean in practice. The U.S. military has taken this opportunity to strike dozens of Islamic State facilities and leaders across the country, marking one of the biggest such actions in recent months, and military leaders have said they would continue to strike terrorist groups on Syrian soil, probably as part of an effort to keep the new Syrian government, whatever its composition and ideological leanings, from working with IS and its allies. Russia has requested a closed-door meeting with the United Nations Security Council to discuss Syria's collapse, and it's been reported that they failed to come to Assad's aid because they're too tied up in Ukraine, and they were not able to move forces from North Africa rapidly enough to do much good, though there is a chance that they will still shift whatever chess pieces they can to the area in order to influence the composition of the new government as it's forming. Iran have said they welcome whatever type of government the Syrian people decide to establish, though it is likely they will also try to nudge that formation in their favor, as Syria has long been an ally and a client state of theirs, and they are no doubt keen to maintain that reality as much as possible, and bare minimum to avoid the establishment of an enemy along their border. and Israel has entered what's supposed to be a demilitarized buffer zone in the Golan Heights because this zone is on Syria's border. They've also captured a buffer zone within Syria itself. They have launched airstrikes on suspected chemical weapon sites in Syria to prevent them from falling into extremist hands, they've said, and Israeli leaders said they want to keep any issues in their neighbor as they're going through this post-Civil War moment from impacting Israeli citizens. And Iraq's government has announced that they're doing basically the same along their shared border with Syria. So the whole region is bulwarking their potential weak points, especially their borders, just in case something goes wrong and violence spreads in the area, rather than being tamped down by all this change. Israel's prime minister and other higher-ups in the government have also claimed responsibility for Assad's toppling, saying it was their efforts against Iran and its proxy forces like Hezbollah that set the stage for the rebels to do what they did, as otherwise these forces would have been too strong and too united for a toppling to work. Notably, the now in charge rebel group has been a long-time enemy of Iran and Hezbollah. So while there is still a lot of uncertainty surrounding all of this, Israel's government is no doubt generally pleased with how things have progressed so far, as this could mean Syria is no longer a reliable corridor for Iran, especially for the purposes of getting weapons to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, along Israel's northern border. That said, this same group is not exactly a fan of Israel and is backed by Turkey, which has been highly critical of Israel's actions in Gaza and Lebanon. So this is an incredibly tumultuous moment in Syria right now and in this region as a whole, because the conflict in Syria has been super impactful on everyone to varying degrees, and this ending to this long-lasting civil war could lead to some positive outcomes, like Syrian refugees who have been scattered across neighboring countries, being able to return home without facing the threat of violence, new rights for the people living within Syria, and the release of political prisoners from infamous facilities, some of which have already been emptied by the rebels. But especially in the short term, there's just a lot of uncertainty, and it'll likely be a while before that uncertainty coalesces into something more knowable and predictable, as at the moment, most of the country is still controlled by various militia groups, backed by different international actors, including Kurdish-led forces backed by the US and forces allied with Turkey in the north. So this change of official governance may shuffle the deck, but rather than stabilizing things, it could result in a new conflict catalyzed by the power vacuum left by the Assad regime and its allies, especially if rebel forces, many of which have been labeled terrorists by governments around the world, which is another wrinkle in all of this, if those groups fail to rally behind one group or individual and instead start fighting each other for the opportunity to become the country's new dominant force. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Algebraist by Ian M. Banks. This is a distant future speculative science fiction novel written by one of my favorite authors. He wrote the Culture series, which is one of my favorite series of any kind of all time. This book takes place in the year 4037. It orients around a species that is incredibly ancient and advanced and pretty much all over the galaxy, everywhere we look, living on gas giants. And humanity's attempt to understand these things and the way that they live, being functionally immortal, in addition to being pervasive and ancient, and how we try to establish that understanding while embroiled in all sorts of conflicts, those conflicts attributed to the relative finitude of human beings and even civilizations like the human civilization. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Algebraist by Ian M. Banks. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.